means I'll introduce Brian. I think most of you know him, but he's just a fantastic person, an incredible researcher. So what is the name of your new institute that now has
Institute for
floors?
Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing, or ISGEM for short.
And he's part of, I don't know, so many federal review committees, is constantly invited to review what's going on, is probably the most well-known adolescent LGBT researcher in the country, and is also very caring, because I don't know how many of his projects he'll talk about, but he doesn't only collect data, he gives back to the youth that he works with, or even those that he doesn't, and so I think we're really fortunate to know him as a researcher, but also as just a great person.
Wow, fabulous introduction. Yeah. So I'm going to talk specifically about some of the work that I've been doing on using social media and online approaches for HIV prevention research with sexual gender minority youth. And I won't get into some of the other things I do on cohorts and other types of research, although at the end I'm happy to answer any kind of questions whatsoever on adolescent HIV research, sexual gender minority health research, etc. Just out of curiosity, how many of you guys are doing projects that involve online recruitment, online data collection, online interventions? Anyone?
Yeah,
John
more
is
like a
thinking
survey
about it.
online.
Okay.
So that's-
And Elizabeth's doing M-Health. So.
Okay.
Sort of participant attitudes towards smartphones.
Okay. Okay. Like a HIV-related care app or something?
Yes,
Okay.
one that's primarily focused on medication adherence, but then also is interested in relapse prevention because of substance use.
Yeah.
adherence.
Oh, great. Cool. Good.
So maybe we should go around.
Yeah,
the way,
that would be
because
great.
I forgot that you were here with the returning nut. So, Jessica, why don't you say what you're doing?
Hi, Jessica Pagano-Train from University of Massachusetts. I'm a nurse, and I work with youth who are HIV infected and at risk. And my project is going to involve building basically a competency training for clinician researchers who are working with the LGBT population.
Oh, interesting. Cool.
I'm John. I'm from UC San Francisco, assistant professor in the Department of Medicine, and my MRP is going to be looking at the framing of the risk and benefits of participating in a hypothetical cure trial.
Very cool.
Hey, I'm Morgan Philman. I'm at Columbia, and I'm doing qualitative work with young Black MSM to better understand how the way that HIV prevention research, categorizes them as a high-risk group and consistently does research with them, understands their own sense of stigma, discrimination, and identity development.
Yeah, cool.
I'm Rebecca Fielding Miller. I'm at UC San Diego. I'm looking at emotional distress and potential for secondary trauma in frontline research staff in Swaziland.
Cool.
I'm Anthony Street. I'm an assistant professor at Morgan State University in the School of Social Work, and my MRP is examining barriers and motivators to research participation among young Black MSM, HIV positive subjects.
Young being what ages?
So 18 to 29.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Adrian Guda. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Windsor, Canada. I'm looking at ethical issues in research conducted with clients of a heroin-assisted treatment program.
Cool. Fabulous. Wow, nice diversity of projects.
Yeah, and Stephanie is looking at the attitudes of MSM to having their biological materials, which are she's at NYU and they're being collected constantly, being used under the broad consent new common rule guidelines in terms of are they willing to say, yeah, anybody can use my biological materials for everything in perpetuity.
Yeah.
Identified.
Interesting. Yeah. Great. Well, I'm just going to dive right in. Feel free to just shout out questions or any comments along the way. What I'm going to do is just give a little bit of overview of some of my experience doing e-health, HIV prevention research, to kind of give you a flavor of the types of projects I've done. Talk a little bit about why I started using the internet. many years ago for HIV and health research. A little bit about how we should think about sort of risk, minimal risk, that standard of what are the risks of everyday life, how do people approach their conceptualizations of privacy on the internet, how do young people approach it, how do their parents approach it, and then take you through a case study of a text messaging HIV prevention program I co-developed with my colleague Michelle Ybarra called Guy to Guy, and which just came out in pediatrics, I think, last week, the RCT. And just kind of talk, we published a paper on the ethics of some of the ethical challenges we face sending teens text messages about sexual health. And I'm going to kind of go through some of those issues as a case study of some of the things to consider when doing this kind of work. I've done a good number of studies using the internet as a way to recruit or engage, to do both observational and intervention research. I, in 1999, did one of the first, actually, like online surveys of the LGBT community. It was an interesting, I was I think a first-year graduate student at Indiana, and some of the issues we faced back then was the IRB office asking how do they stamp the consent form on the screen of everybody who's going to fill out that was an actual question, on the screen of every survey that was going to be done online. And you can just see in some ways how far things have come, but we still get a lot of interesting questions about online research. That was during the time of shortly after Clinton's impeachment for the question of, what does is mean? And I was very interested in how people having same-sex behaviors define what it means to have sex. We give people, at that time we used to give a lot of sexual health surveys that would just say how many people have you had sex with, et cetera, and didn't necessarily define what we meant by sex. And so I was interested in the heterogeneity and how people define it. In 2002, I did an online diary study that we recruited through a website that was, at the time, one of the most high-volume gay websites on the internet. And people did daily diaries for 30 days about their mood, their how they met their partners, their sexual behavior. One of the things that we found in that study was that guys who met a partner online had more partners, had more condomless sex. But if you followed the same person over time, you found that they actually had less condomless sex with partners they met online than with partners they met through other ways, like through bars or through friends. And so that was an interesting paper that was sort of challenging that idea that internet is a high-risk venue, and instead it's more the idea that people who are looking for sex go to websites where you can find sex, just like they might go to a bathhouse or somewhere else to find sex. So, of course, if you're looking for sex, you're probably going to have more sex than someone who's not looking for sex. Project Q2 is a longitudinal study of 16 to 20-year-old LGBT youth that we're still actually following. 10 years later, we're still following the teenagers. They're now in their mid-20s. And looking at developmental characteristics, risk and protective factors for mental health, HIV, substance use. That's an interesting issue because when they signed up for the study, they thought it was going to be a one-year longitudinal study, and now 10 years later, 80% of them are still in the study and have done now, over a dozen longitudinal visits. And most of them are quite excited about still being in the study. Of course, others just oblige us in continuing to come in. That was one that led to a paper that I published, which I think is how Celia and I got connected, is a paper I published in Archives of Sexual Behavior on some of the ethical challenges of doing research with LGBT adolescents without parental permission. And that was a project that was funded with a 2-year grant, and I spent nearly the entire first year trying to get IRB approval to do the project. And so then I wrote a paper in Archives of Sexual Behavior, which I think didn't come out until 2011, but or maybe it's 2009, on some of the ethical issues in studying this population. And that's sort of what was my foray into getting into doing some ethics research. I've also done several online interventions: Keep It Up 1.0, Keep It Up 1.5, Keep It Up 2.0, now we have Keep It Up 2.5. We're hoping to have Keep It Up 3.0 soon. This is an online HIV prevention program for 18 to 29-year-old men who have sex with men that just tested HIV negative at a testing clinic. And the goal is for them to keep up their HIV negative status, which is why we call it Keep It Up. It's an entirely online intervention. It's got like an online soap opera. It's got interactive exercises, games. There's a virtual reality bar that they go into and interact with other characters. We've now evaluated it both in a pilot randomized clinical trial where we showed significant reductions in condomless anal sex. We did a community-based implementation where we enrolled 600 young MSM in the Chicago community just as a service of getting this intervention out. As soon as we knew it was starting to work, we started implementing it in Chicago. We're now implementing it in Jackson, Mississippi, also as a service, which we're continuing to evaluate. And we just finished a 3-city randomized control trial of Keep It Up in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, as well as with an online sample. And what's unique about that 2.0 study is we're doing rectal and urethral STI testing through the mail. So we mail people a self-collection kit where they perform a rectal swab on themselves, collect a urine sample, mail it back to the CDC. The CDC does the testing for us, and then we provide them the results. And if they're positive, refer them to treatment in their local area. We also had about 180 guys that tested themselves for HIV at home as well. And that actually worked quite well.
What percent seroconvert?
We did not, in that particular study, have anyone who had a positive test result, which was somewhat surprising to us, actually. Given just we'd expect maybe 1% or something, but in that, out of 180, we didn't have any positives. They had to take a picture of the test result and send it to us so we could see the result and make sure, it was negative. Those results are hopefully about to come out. They're under review right now, but the intervention produced a 40% reduction in rectal STIs compared to the control, which we're really excited about. A huge, this will be the first e-health intervention to show significant impact on a biomedical outcome. But don't tell anyone I told you that because it's embargoed. Oh, I guess she's recording this. I probably shouldn't have said. I have to edit that part out. Anyway, and then I've also done some things related to shipping HIV test kits to men through the mail, allowing them to distribute it. The guy-to-guy intervention, which I'm going to talk about more later, was a text messaging intervention. So I've done a lot of different modalities of e-health types of programs, online focus groups that Celia and I have done a lot of lately, text messaging, online, some things with apps as well. So, I think that begs the question of why am I doing all of this with technology, and why am I focusing on using technology in particular to reach young men who have sex with men? I think part of it is that obviously, the digital divide has shrunk. Most people have access to the internet, have access to the internet on their phone. There's high rates of use. There's a lot of acceptability about accessing sexual contact online or on your phone amongst this population. Obviously, it facilitates data collection. I mean, we used to talk a lot about how you didn't have to enter the data, when you collected it online, but I don't know if anyone even has people fill out paper and pencil things anymore. You can collect your data 24/7. You can get more geographically diverse populations. We used to talk about accessing hard-to-reach populations, although I think that phrase has gone out of fashion for good reason. More like haven't tried populations is probably more important than hard to reach. But there's ways to reach groups that are certainly underrepresented in a lot of research by doing it online. We also know that most adults, this is data from the Pew Internet and American Life Project. If you're at all interested in what people are doing on the internet, this is your definitive source. They do regular polls of Americans about their use of the internet, their use of social media, etc. You can go to their website and just pull data, and they have really fantastic data. But what we're seeing is that obviously more and more people are using the internet, 3/4 of people having used the internet to look for some kind of health information, over half to look for information on a specific disease or medical problem. This is amongst adults, and we might assume that it might be slightly higher amongst adolescents who have interest in a health issue. Of course, adolescents tend not to have that many health issues, so they're maybe less likely to look for health information because of that. But if they have symptoms or a problem, I think they're more likely to use the internet than adults to look for information about it. And more and more people are using the internet as a way to even try to self-diagnose their health issue. So this Pew data talks about people being online diagnosers, a third of patients looking up their specific medical condition. Half of those people who looked up information talked to their doctor about what they found online. If you've ever done that with your doctor, you get very mixed reactions from your provider when you say, I looked this up online, and you might get an eye roll out of them, or they might be cool with it. And they're saying 40% of people who looked something up online had their condition confirmed by a clinician. So certainly it is a tool that we can use to disseminate health information to help people understand their health conditions. And increasingly, people are interested in using apps as well for tracking. Does anybody in the room have a Fitbit? Yeah, so a third or a quarter of you guys have Fitbits. People are very interested in tracking their behavior using apps and technology. How many steps did you take, et cetera. About a third of people who are using those kind of tracking devices say that it's affected their health decision making. It's led them to talk to their doctor about something. It's changed their approach to their health. So that idea of giving people a tool to track their behavior is in some ways something that's been around for a long time in terms of like food diaries and diaries. Obviously, I did a diary study of sexual behavior over a decade ago, and at the time, actually, there were several people who were in that diary study that when the study ended had said, can I keep filling out the diary? I'm enjoying tracking my mood and my sexual behavior and my substance use, etc. One of my mentees had got a A-START R03 from NIDA to do a diary study where he randomized people to do different types of diaries. Diaries where you fill them out every day, diaries where you fill it out every week, diaries where you get feedback at the end of the week where it shows you, like, is your substance use going up? Is it stable? Is it going down? Diaries where you get feedback relative to everyone else. Are you having more sex than everyone else in the study? Are you having, not with exact numbers, but sort of, color-coded information? And he was very interested in whether it changed people's behavior. We use diaries both to observe things as well as to intervene. And he showed actually very few effects, very few differences in the types of diaries in terms of whether people changed their behavior or not. It was mostly the people who wanted to change their behavior going into the diary that used the diary as a way to change their behavior. Obviously we all know the IRB regulations about what constitutes minimal risk, and they calibrate it against the risks of everyday life. But it's rare that we spend much time thinking, except every now and then there's a flare-up in the media about hacking. We've been talking a lot about hacking lately in the media, but also other issues about stolen identities, et cetera, that get attention in the media. But thinking a little bit about what are the risks of technology. You see, there's actually a whole, I think, website dedicated to pictures of people having accidents while they're walking and texting, falling into a pothole, things like that. There's a lot of kind of examples in the media about some of the risks of technology, but I don't think it's been well studied. It actually, until probably several of Celia's fellows have really started digging into some of the online privacy concerns and thoughts that people have about doing research online. In terms of how teens think about it, this is just again some data from Pew through 2012 showing really huge increases in being on social media sites over time amongst teens and amongst adults, both Twitter and social networking sites like Facebook. I think at this point they're saying some people are leaving Facebook because now their parents are on it. We still do access a lot of teens through Facebook or Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. So interesting now to think about what are teens doing when they're on the internet? What kind of things are they posting? What kind of things are they disclosing? So again, this is some Pew data showing basically increases from 2006 through to 6 years later, 2012, in terms of what people are posting in their social media profiles. So 90% of youth posting pictures of themselves. That's probably not surprising. Most social media even requires you more or less to put at least a profile picture. But most teens probably go well beyond just the profile picture. Reporting what school they're in, what town they live in. Some people posting publicly their email address, in some cases even their cell phone number. So thinking again about the kinds of information that people just disclose in their social media profiles. Interestingly, you get into the question of privacy settings on social media. What information can be publicly accessible? There are regulations around capturing data that's publicly available, things that people put in the public versus things that they have an assumption of privacy for. Who here would say they understand the privacy settings on Facebook? Okay, so you feel like you have a pretty firm understanding of what information in your profile is shown to who. What about information about what Facebook does with the information they have?
Whatever they want, basically.
Yes, that's probably the safest assumption, yeah. Most teens say that they've set their profile to private. I think increasingly it's hard to say fully what's public and private because most profiles are sort of partially public, partially private to some people, public to others. Obviously, it's gotten more complicated over time. I bet that number of sort of partially private is probably what most people would fall into today. Here's some data they collected on what concerns teens have about third-party access to their personal information by essentially what they're putting on social media sites like Facebook. And you can see most of them fall into either the sort of the distribution is slightly skewed towards the not concerned or not too concerned about what Facebook is using their data for, who they're selling it to. I think, most of us have had probably that epiphany where we've searched for something on Amazon and then logged into Facebook and that same product was advertised on our Facebook page. And you start thinking about, there's this vast repository of data where all of these things are getting connected. And I think for most people, that might be their first realization that there is this sort of sharing of information across platforms. Teens, unless they're shopping on Amazon or something, may not have those observations. But in general, people are, there's a small number of people who describe themselves as very concerned about, what's being done with their information.
Does this information take into account when, I think it was Facebook, there was a big, news thing about Facebook listening into the microphone?
Oh, I hadn't heard about that. Huh.
So apparently there's when you have on the Live app, one of the settings on your on iPhone is that it's always on.
Oh,
so
right.
The mic never turns off, so it's essentially picking up on what you're talking about and using it to kind of look for user preferences. But it was a big old thing about Facebook listening in and basically never stop listening to what's going on in your private life.
Yeah.
Like the NSA?
Yeah, I mean who they're sharing it with.
The NSA
Yeah.
actually just has access to that.
They have a user agreement.
No, they have they absolutely do.
Yeah. I think this is probably this data might be slightly preceding some of those kinds of things. This is some actually qualitative data, again, collected from Pew on teen understanding of how their personal data is used, which is interesting in sort of how they describe it. So a middle schooler says, anyone who isn't friends with me can't see anything about my profile except my name and gender. I don't believe that Facebook would do anything with my info. A high schooler says, I don't know if Facebook gives access to others. I hope not. I don't think Facebook should give anyone access to profile information. It depends on what kind of profile information they'd share. If it was only my age and gender, I wouldn't mind. If they went into detail and shared personal things, I would mind. I don't think it'd be fair, which is an interesting word, for a high schooler, because it's my information and should not be shared with others unless I decide to. So these are the typical responses that you get. These aren't just like carefully selected. These are typical responses about understanding of personal data use. Pew also asked parents about their attitudes towards their child's information being shared. And you see that concerns by parents are much stronger than they are, at least these are slightly different options, but in terms of the issues that they could see would arise with their teens sharing information online, with a lot of concerns about interactions with strangers, what their reputation will be depending on what they post. Much more information, almost the majority of parents being very concerned or somewhat concerned about the information that's given to advertisers, whereas you can remember that was a very small proportion amongst teens. And then impact on future opportunities. A majority of parents check their teens' web history or social media profile. Nearly half look through their teen's cell phone history. Fewer use tech-based parental controls. So 60% checked so this is parents of 13 to 17-year-olds checked which website their teens visited, checked their social media profile, looked through their text messages. So for us, when we were doing a text messaging-based sexual health intervention with 14 to 18-year-old gay and bisexual boys, one of the things we spent a lot of time talking with them on the phone about was who's looking at your phone, do you have privacy, have your parents checked your phone before, do your friends look at your phone, do you know how to set up privacy settings on your phone, etc. And if they had any concerns, if they said, well, I don't know if my parents check my phone, then we would say you probably shouldn't be in this study. If they said things like, my parents have no idea where my phone even is, or they don't know how to use a phone, or they're not, they don't know how to unlock my phone, then we felt like it was more safe for them to be involved in the study. Or if they said, my parents know I'm in the study, I told them and they're cool with it, well then maybe it's fine if the parents check the phone. So we did a lot of discussions with the young people before they enrolled in the study about their safety of being in a study like that. So has anyone ever looked at Google Analytics before? Yeah, some of the folks who are involved in tech projects. So we have a website. We have a website called impactprogram.org, which is the name of my research lab. And we use it as a portal to disseminate information about our work. We create videos with information for LGBT youth that stems from the work we do. And we have a grant from Google that gives us free advertising on Google to promote our work. And so we get several 100,000 visitors to our website every year. So we get a pretty high volume of visitors to sort of accessing our research information. Our staff writes blogs. For example, this is one of our medical students who was a NCAA gymnast who wrote about being out in the NCAA. So our staff write blogs. We also have information about the work we're doing, et cetera. So we look a lot at our Google Analytics to understand what kind of information Google provides to websites that want to track their users. And if you have access to a domain and have access to Google Analytics, I encourage you to spend some time playing with it sometime, because it's really well designed and quite interesting to find out what you can and can't find out about the people who come to your website. So, for example, this is just a heat map of where visitors to our website came, at a certain day. And you can see, obviously, we're in Chicago, so there's a lot of people from Illinois that come to our website, from California. And we can drill down to the level of a city and see how many people come from a particular city. But we still don't know the identity of that person. So it might say that there's 50 people that came from Miami that day, but I don't know necessarily who those 50 people are. Now, if there was one person from Miami and I just got off the phone with somebody from Miami asking about our work, I might infer that that's the one person from Miami that was on the phone, but there would be no other way to really connect the identities of people. We know what keywords they searched for to get to our site. We know how they got to our site, what referred them to the site. Was it an email? Was it a Facebook post? And we know what networks they're on, so what domain they're on. So we know, are they on a northwestern.edu domain? Are they on a Comcast? US, we get a lot of feds who visit our site. And we can see, again, I might get an email from somebody from the Department of Justice, and then I'll see that there was people from the Department of Justice visiting our website. And again, I might be able to make the link through that information, but other than that, at least in terms of Google Analytics, that's the level that we get to in terms of tracking. And I think IRBs get very confused about this because they think that if you have someone's IP address, that you as a researcher can very easily identify who that person is. And the reality is that that's simply not true. I had a big discussion with my former institution where I got into this big debate about whether IP addresses were easily identifiable or not. And I showed him this system where you could look up someone's IP address. So we looked up his IP address. I should have thought this ahead better. we looked up his IP address and then put it into the Who Is search to see where the address was that it was registered to. Sure enough, it was the building we were standing in. But that's because it was the administrative building for the entire university. So any IP address on the university, the entire campus would give you that same building address. So he said, oh, they know exactly what building we're in. And I said, yeah, but that's because the entire domain for the university is registered to this single address. And so really the only way you can identify someone from an IP address is if you have a subpoena to the records of the service provider to de-identify that person. And so I get frustrated sometimes, I think, when IRBs just reflexively say you shouldn't collect IP addresses because you can figure out who that person is. That's very important information for the validity of your sample, is one way to make sure you don't have repeat participants. So I think it's important to push back against IRBs for that when they say that. Has anyone been told that they can't collect IP addresses in online research because of that reason?
Yeah. And we used to use daily diaries, and they'd connect to Qualtrics, which can collect IP addresses.
Yeah. And did you ever figure out who someone was by their IP address? No, exactly. You didn't subpoena the service provider. Yeah, exactly.
But it's hard. We were in a study with college students, and it was hard to know if it was the same person repeating what they're doing, or if they're all in the same dorm.
Yeah.
And that was really challenging. Except, fortunately, they weren't that smart. They kept changing their Gmail, but with the same initials, or you know what I mean, like it just reversed. But it's interesting too, because like you said, you have no idea, because the IP, especially colleges or whatever, are shared by so many people.
Exactly. Yeah, it's something that's useful. It's one piece of information that helps you decide if maybe it's the same person that's been participating over and over, but it's not definitive. It's an important piece of information, but it's not the be-all and end-all for sure.
You need it anyway to confirm geography.
Yeah, exactly.
Sample.
Yeah, there was a colleague of mine actually here in New York who had a NIH-funded project doing online HIV research that he, after the study was over, and I think he's written publicly about this, but after the study was over, realized that the majority of his participants were in China and were scamming the study out of gift cards, and they'd set up this whole network of a place where they could send gift cards, and then they would get sent back to China or sold, and it wasn't later until he had a new research assistant who went and looked up all the IP addresses and realized that they were outside of the United States, that he was able to figure that out. So, I mean, again, just in terms of validity, being a good steward of federal money and not having it wasted on scammers, I think that's important information to collect. And we collect it in sort of real time and do a lookup before we ever pay anyone to make sure that it's, ideally in the geographic location they say they're in, as well as, that it's in the United States. Again, it's not definitive, it's just one piece of information. So what I want to share with you a little bit is this case study of this project we did called Guy to Guy, which was a text messaging based HIV prevention program or sexual health promotion program for 14 to 18-year-olds. And we've got a couple articles that have been published about the project if you're interested in reading more. We have a couple publications where we talk about the online focus group method that we use to do interviews with teens to create the program and to get their feedback on the messages. We have a paper just sort of how we developed it, sort of our iterative process of creating the messages, sharing them with youth, getting feedback, revising them. And then we have this article in Journal of Adolescent Health, which is a case study of some of the ethical considerations in both recruitment of this population as well as implementing this text message-based intervention. And then the outcome of the RCT, it just came out in pediatrics. The short story is the intervention didn't work. It didn't increase condom use, didn't decrease condomless sex. It did increase HIV testing, though, or self-report of HIV testing at least, so that was a positive outcome. So just to kind of give you a sense of how we tailored and created the text-based HIV prevention program, I know most of you have community advisory boards or youth advisory boards or advisory boards for your project. We use them for pretty much all of our projects. We have a standing youth advisory board for our institute because we do so much youth work that advises us across multiple projects, and then each project may or may not have its own youth advisory board as well. We started doing online youth advisory boards as well. We have Facebook closed groups where for an intervention we're developing now called SMART, we have a closed group of young gay and bisexual men that basically give us almost daily feedback about things. So we'll post a logo and get feedback from people. We'll post some videos or messages that we're thinking about using, and can really almost get real-time feedback from this diverse group of 40 young men. And again, not everyone responds to every post, but it's a really great way to get sort of real-time engagement with young people. We have a group that's in English and a group that's in Spanish where we're kind of posting things and getting feedback. So I think, obviously, feedback from your target population is really critical for intervention development. So we did online focus groups to develop the content and logistics. We did focus groups really just asking about what are the factors that influence your health? What are the barriers to getting tested? Where would you get condoms if you needed to get them? Where would you store them? Has anyone talked to you about sex and HIV before? So really just trying to better understand the experiences of these young people and how a text messaging intervention could work for them. What's the right number of messages to send? How many is too many? How many would you be willing to read? What are your privacy issues? We also had what we called our YAC, or our Youth Advisory Council. So that was the group that, instead of asking these broad questions about their experiences, we actually showed them the intervention content, the messages, and they went through and read them and gave feedback. And we did 2 rounds of that. And then we did this pilot randomized trial nationally to really assess the acceptability and feasibility of the project. So this is kind of an example of what our online focus groups look like. I think we've continually refined the interface with different projects to make it look more and more attractive and engaging. But this is our first time we did it. And you can see this was the post from the moderator asking a question. People could reply to it. They would reply with a quote of what the question was, and then they could interact and ask follow-up questions of each other. We could send probes to people. And we found this to be a really productive way to do focus group work with this population because it let us get a national sample, and they loved it. I mean, the young people were super engaged. They, some of them, they even asked if they could start their own forums to talk about theater or talk about dating or talk about other topics that were interesting to them. So it was a really successful method. And we asked a lot of questions about sort of privacy and outing so that we could deliver the intervention in a way that would be safe for them. So we said things like, what kind of worries do you have about the text or the info that, on your phone, if it could out you? One participant said, I think the only danger would be getting outed, but a guy who signs up for this should likely know that's a repercussion for getting such messages. You guys should make sure that these repercussions are known. So again, we did a lot of discussion with a participant before they were allowed to enroll to talk about their phone and privacy and what if someone saw the messages, what would be the repercussions of it. Participants said, I think the combination of using a lock and keeping the phone on our person is the easiest way to prevent outing. My parents are extremely protective. They read my texts on a regular basis. It makes me feel violated and ashamed because I have a lot of inner turmoil about my sexuality. So that would be an example of a participant we probably wouldn't have enrolled into the text-based program because it doesn't seem like it would be a safe experience for them. The aim of the project was to deliver sexuality HIV prevention information that's relevant to young men who identified as gay, bisexual, or queer. We had 6 modules talking about condom use, abstinence. So half the participants had never had sex. They were abstinent at that point, and then half were already sexually active at the time of enrollment. In addition to these 6 modules, we also had a text buddy component. So we actually paired 2 teens up with each other, and they could send text messages to each other through our system, where they could practice the exercises that we talked about in the intervention. So what could you imagine would be some of the ethical or safety concerns we would have about doing something like that? Pairing 2 gay teenagers up to text each other.
Well, it depends if they're all in the same city. And you basically serve as a hookup program.
Mm-hmm. So what would be a way to prevent that?
I mean, unless you want to vet every text. That's a lot of that work.
Yeah. So this was a national program. So one of the things we did is we made sure that they were at least 500 miles apart because we felt like that's a distance that would be hard for a teenager to traverse easily by themselves. But yet then you get into issues of time zones. So we don't want someone in New York matched with someone in California because they'll be texting their buddy at 3 in the morning. So they had to be within one time zone of each other, but at least 500 miles apart, which was hard because, you know, it was an RCT. There were only 150 guys approximately in the intervention arm. So we had to really shuffle things around to make sure that, and they were sort of enrolling continuously, so we only had a small pool to pick from. But, you know, that was one approach that we used, and I'll talk about some of the others. But, you know, that was something we were quite worried about, that we didn't want to turn this into a hookup service or have people meeting each other in ways that could be not so great. In addition to the Text Buddy program, another feature is that we did have a publicly facing website that was designed for parents and teachers. So we created that and we told the young people about the fact that it existed. It was an option if they wanted to provide that information to their parents about the study or not. And then also the program for teachers was if a young person did get caught with the text messages at school, that way they could refer the school to the website and have some legitimization that this is a university research project and that it wouldn't just be their word that, yeah, I'm in this program that's texting me about condoms and stuff, that they would have a resource they could immediately turn to if somebody did find the messages. And then we also had this feature we called G2 Genie, which is they could text in questions on different topics and it would send back pre-designed responses to those messages. It wasn't the smartest genie. It was sort of like it was sort of looked for a keyword in their message and then it would just respond with pre-written messages on that topic. So if it had the word dating, we would just start sending them tips about dating, or if it had the questions about pain during sex, we had pre-written messages about pain, for example, or where to find condoms, etc. And they could just keep they could just say more and it would just keep sending them messages on that topic. But it was a way to make it sort of interactive where they could get selective information in the moment. It was an RCT. People were randomized and balanced on sexual identity and sexual experience. We purposely recruited half the sample to be sexually experienced and half that had not been sexually experienced, stratified by age. 40% of the samples were 14 and 15-year-olds. And that gets complicated as you're thinking about finding 17 and 18-year-olds that aren't sexually active, 14 and 15-year-olds that are sexually active, just given the developmental trajectory of sexual initiation. You know, we had to do a lot of balancing and we wanted a racially diverse sample, et cetera. So there was a lot of balancing that we did throughout the enrollment to make sure we had that sort of broad representation. We were interested in getting sexually abstinent participants because of Michelle and I's perspective that, you know, your first sexual encounter plays a really big role in your sort of future trajectory of sexual behavior. And if you use a condom at your first sexual encounter, we think that that could set you up for a trajectory of using condoms in the future. And so we wanted to try to find guys that hadn't yet initiated. But that creates also research issues around detecting effects, and can you detect effects of the intervention when half your sample isn't perhaps going to be even having sex during the course of the study. The control group got health education, so they got information about a whole range of health issues. And the content was tailored based on their sexual experience. So if they were sexually active, they got slightly different messages than if they'd never had sex. And we really fed them messages that were written by young people on that topic. So the guys who we did focus groups that hadn't had sex said words like, my body's a temple, I'm saving it for the right guy. And we would say, you know, this is a message we heard from a young people, you know, and sent that to them to sort of make sure that it resonated with the population. 14 to 18-year-olds, cisgender males, identified as gay, bisexual, queer. They had to have a cell phone. They had to have an unlimited text messaging plan. They had to have texted for at least 6 months, and they had to plan on keeping that number for at least 6 more months. And as you can see, the age range was sorry, I don't know why it says range is 14 to 16. It's 14 to 18. The average age was 16. About a third of the sample was non-white. About a quarter to a fifth was Hispanic. Majority identified as gay. and that's the sort of distribution of their sexual experiences. So this is the table that's in this Journal of Adolescent Health article on some of the ethical considerations that I just wanted to spend some time talking about. And I think this is a good example. We really modeled it after this paper written by Sheena Bull in a study she did online called the Just Us study, which was a Facebook intervention for heterosexual youth around sexual health. And we really went through some of the ethical, major domains from the Belmont report and talked about how we address them, what the potential ethical issues are related to that, and how we address them. So it's a good example, I think, when you're doing research that you can get an additional publication, really just addressing some of these ethical issues, particularly if you're working in an area where there's a lot of questions about some of the ethical approaches. So one of the things that you have, obviously, the issue of respect for persons and making sure that you have informed consent. So one of the things that we did is we had a specific protocol where that we did talk with the participant on the phone before they enrolled to really make sure that they understood the study. We did a capacity assessment where after they had been given a copy of the consent form, after it was explained to them, we quizzed them and asked them questions to make sure they understood what are the risks of being in the study for them, what do they see as the benefits, what would happen if they decided they didn't want to do the study, could they change their mind later if they started the study and decided later that they didn't want to do it. So we asked them those questions, and they had to demonstrate to us that they were able to understand and reason with those issues. And we wrote the assent form in an easy-to-understand language that we had actually shown to our Youth Advisory Council to make sure they could talk about it and gave us suggestions on language to improve it. In terms of beneficence and risk and benefit, our perspective is that requiring parental permission both severely limits the validity of your study, but also because there's so many young people who won't do sexual health research if they have to get their parents' permission, but also could put some people at risk because if they're not out to their parents, or even some youth who are out have relationships, negative relationships around their sexual orientation. So we had requested and were granted a waiver of parental permission by both of the IRBs that were involved in the study. Obviously, issues of privacy and confidentiality. We did this safety assessment with youth to make sure that it was safe for them to be in the study. And we also had like a sheet that we sent them that explained some things they could do to help protect their privacy on their phone. So, one of the things you may notice if you have an iPhone is that you can have your text messages show up on the lock screen or not. And something I had never even really thought of before we did this study, but that was one of the first things the youth told us is make sure to tell kids how to turn off that setting so that their text messages about condoms and anal sex don't show up on their screen, even when their phone is locked. Can you close that door, would you mind? Squeaky doors. So we did the safety assessment with them, but we also had some instructions for them to think about settings on their phone. We thought a lot about inclusion, racial diversity in terms of region, and had developed a really carefully created algorithm for advertising on Facebook to reach different types of participants. As you can see, we were successful at least in getting a fairly diverse sample. We used Facebook at the time, which is, was and is still the most. Boy, that's a squeaky door.
It's a crazy door.
Somebody just standing there, like opening and closing it. One of the issues around justice is really making sure that if you're creating, at least from my perspective, if you're creating interventions and services, that you actually have a pipeline to get them out to the population, that you're not just creating them in a study and then getting your publication and then that's the end of it. And so, we really thought about if this worked, which there's mixed, results in terms of whether it worked or not, a real strategy about what our next steps were in terms of we had planned to make the text messages publicly available so that others could use them in text messaging interventions, and, really involving the participants in the co-creation of the content, and, really making sure that we were inclusive and had a diverse population. Some of the protections, as I said, was the safety assessment, the how-to guide. We had also terms of like a code of conduct for the text buddies. So they had to agree to a code of conduct, which would mean they didn't use slurs, for example, in their text messages. They wouldn't try to send sexually explicit messages to their partner. All of the messages got routed through our server, and we did monitor them, and we monitored them in 2 ways. So there were some messages that were just blocked, and so we had a preset list of words that if you're using some kind of slur, we're just not going to deliver that message. And then there were other words that were flagged for review before they got sent, and so if it was something that might imply suicidal thoughts or something that we thought could put their partner in a very uncomfortable situation, and also we need to keep an eye on, we would hold those messages before they got released, and they would get reviewed by one of our staff before they got sent out.
So I know there's all sorts of complex ways to do like text analysis online. Did you just have like keywords, or did you have something complicated going on with like send analysis, or how are you?
We used something sort of intermediate. So we had keywords, but then we also used like fuzzy logic where it would match on similar words automatically. And so that's sort of, or also like adding wildcards to suffixes or misspellings and stuff were all sort of matched so that those would all get identified. One of my mentees now just recently had gotten a Center for AIDS Research grant to do computational linguistic analysis of the text messages, the historical text messages that we have, obviously de-identified, to look to see if there's better ways to match guys. So one of the things that's interesting as we've really now, this project's been over for a while, but really looked through the text messages again with a fresh set of eyes, you realize that there's some buddies who really connected and shared and had a very rich discussion. And then there's some who just texted for a little bit and then didn't really, engage. I mean, for most people, the distribution of text messages is, like that, for pairs where it's like in the beginning. And then there's a little bump periodically where we specifically send to them, talk to your buddy about this topic, and then there would be kind of a reinvigoration of the discussion. But one of the things we're interested in is, are there linguistic approaches that we could use to better match buddies so that they could have a more robust interaction? And my mentee is a linguist, and one of the things he's interested in is they've done these analyses of speed dating, showing that there's some minimal features of language that if you match people on, they're much more likely to have like a connection, like in speed dating. So even just how frequently you use certain prepositions and some other simple linguistic features tends to really predict whether people will be a match in speed dating or not. So one of the things we're doing is we're doing this linguistic analysis of each of the messages in the pair to see if there's a way we could better match people in interventions like this in the future.
When messages got flagged, what was the response time for somebody to review?
Well, we had one staff in California and one staff in Chicago and one staff in Vermont. And so they were all sort of taking shifts based on their different hours. And it was fairly quick. I mean, obviously, if the message went through late at night, it wouldn't get released right away. But pretty much one of those people was on the website from what would be the equivalent of probably 8 to 8 pretty much all day. And it was just a website where there'd be a pop-up that there's a message that was flagged, and they would just review it and release it if it was ready to be released. We didn't want them communicating outside of our system, because obviously we wanted to monitor the interactions, both in terms of for research purposes to see how well it went, but also for the safety of the pair. So we also blocked their attempts to exchange contact information with each other, so they couldn't send an email, they couldn't send their Facebook name, they couldn't send their own name, they couldn't send their own last name to the participant because that was blocked. So there were a lot of things that we blocked so that they couldn't circumvent the system. We also blocked any pictures from being sent, so our server wouldn't even receive a picture if it was sent, which was for a lot of reasons a very good idea. So there was flagged content. When we look back at the interaction, a third of them did get some warning at some point about an infraction, like, no, we know you're trying to exchange contact information, you need to wait. We did let them exchange contact information at the end of the study, but they couldn't do it during the study period. Half of them did discuss the intervention content. The other half either didn't have much interaction or they were just talking about what's going on in school, whatever. But we still thought that was actually quite valuable because, many of these young men feel very isolated and that there isn't somebody like them that they can talk to. So a quarter of them shared their coming out stories. We did have some that disclosed self-injury behavior, and we did watch those interactions, quite closely. There was one pair, so I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. There was one pair where I did intervene and had to call both of the participants to talk because one of them was sharing some history of self-harm, and I had to talk to his buddy to see how his buddy was dealing with hearing about that. And then the guy who disclosed it, I had to make sure was safe and wasn't having any current active suicidal ideation, and had to, try to get him referred to some services. And we ultimately did split up that pair because the buddy who heard the information was just saying, that's too much, I don't want to be hearing that kind of stuff. And so then I ended up becoming the buddy of the other guy, which, it's just what we had to do. So, that's one of the issues, obviously when you create connections between young people, you have to be ready for all the monitoring and stuff that goes along with it. And, it's interesting, I think at the end of the study, I thought the text buddy was valuable. I think my co-PI, Michelle, felt like it was too much trouble, that it was, if she was doing the study over again, she probably would have left it out. And I felt like, well, maybe it's just myself having grown up as like a gay teen and feeling very isolated. Like I felt like there was so much meaning in the ability to let people have somebody that they could connect to that I thought it was worth the trouble of sort of having to do all the monitoring and everything. But I do think we could improve it if we did something again.
Were you able to, I realize that graph is like not the most accurate thing in the world. When you were looking at the level of communication, were you able to see how geography played into it? Like, say if kids in New York and San Francisco maybe texted less versus some kid in Canada, if there was some sort of rural urban.
Yeah, we haven't. We just fit a model to these distributions to just try to understand, is there one pattern of sort of decline that may be faster or slower in most people, or are there different patterns? And it does seem like if you fit a model to it, there really is just this overall general pattern of decline. But for some people, it was, the intercept is higher than others and the slope is different than others. But now that we've sort of characterized a model that fits the data, the next question would be, what predicts more interaction? Is it sort of, we do have measures of how socially connected they feel, how involved they are in the gay community. So we can look at our kids who felt more isolated, were they willing to text more? The other thing we did is we fed a model looking at just one person's messages. So this is, say, this very rough distribution is both messages. And we looked at whether there's more information if you separate it out as each individual's texting patterns. And reality is there was no value in separating it out, which suggests that in most of them were returned messages. So there was very few cases where somebody would text something out and not hear back from their buddy. So I think that's a positive, at least, that people weren't sort of reaching out and then never hearing back. But I think that's the next question, is sort of for who did it? Was it a useful service? And can we pair them up in a better way? So one of the things we're thinking about doing is having them write a paragraph, and then we'll do the linguistic analysis of that paragraph and then extract some features that we could use to pair people up in a way that would match their communication styles. But also things like, are you living in a rural area? Like two kids in different rural areas of the United States might have a lot more in common than. But just reading the messages, that the differences were things that people probably enjoyed talking about the most. When you read the narratives, it's like, somebody who lives in Hollywood and somebody who lives in a rural area just talking about, this is what it's like living here, and then the other person being like, no, I'm the only gay kid in my school. And so I don't know if that difference is good in terms of evoking some really interesting conversations, or if it's maybe insurmountable because their life experiences are too different. Were you going to ask something? Oh, okay.
A few more minutes.
Yep. Any other questions about the text buddy?
And how did you deal with remuneration if the parents didn't know necessarily that they were in the study?
I'm trying to remember. I think we gave them an Amazon gift card so that they could order something.
Online, so they didn't really have to show up at their house. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they could choose iTunes, if they wanted to just download music, or if they wanted an Amazon, if they were able to receive packages. Yeah. iTunes is nice that way because it's sort of, it's a benefit, but it's something you just, again, have on your phone if you have control of your phone. I think Amazon, you can also download music. That was my last slide, actually. So, any other questions or?
What did the teens say they liked or didn't like about being in the intervention?
Yeah, one of the things that they really liked was that the messages were written specifically for them, for young gay and bisexual boys, and I think that few of them had ever experienced anything like that before. They felt like, some of the saddest discussions I had was kids saying things like, we don't use condoms because we can't get pregnant, and the only thing we learned in school was about pregnancy.
Yeah.
And so, just the fact that we were talking about connections between young men, they felt really affirmed, and they felt like it was really very relevant to them in a way they hadn't experienced before. I think the other thing they really liked about it is that in most of my work, I really try to take a very comprehensive sexual health perspective versus just HIV education. So the messages also had a lot of content about healthy dating relationships, coming out, self-acceptance, information about how to avoid like pain or problems if you are engaging in sexual behavior. And so I think that they liked that as well, that it wasn't just HIV is a virus and here's how it's transmitted and here's how you can prevent it, but it was really like messages from other young men like them about their lives and their experiences, and so I think they really liked that. Yeah. We sent them 6 to 10 messages a day for 6 weeks. So they got a lot of text messages from us, but most of them said that they read them all and they, felt like they were beneficial. I mean, the average number of messages for guys this age is like 60 to 100 text messages a day. So like our 6 to 10 was just, a drop in the ocean. Other questions?
Are you doing a next, like a follow-up? Because you sort of alluded to it, kind of. But
Yeah. So I have ambivalence about the text messaging-based approach because I think that, first of all, it didn't really change. It changed, like when we looked at all of our mediators and all of our behavioral outcomes, literally we saw like no effect. And I've done several e-health sex education programs, one called Queer Sex Ed, Keep It Up, and have seen like much more. We've been able to move the dial a lot more, and so I do feel like there might be something about the multimedia, being able to see videos, being able to see role model stories, that can be much more impactful than perhaps just text messages. So I have ambivalence about the text messaging approach for something as complicated as sexual behavior. I think it can work for like reminding people to do things they already want to do, or maybe simple behavior change for things that people already want to do as well. But I think changing motivations, giving people skills is quite complicated to do in 140 characters or whatever. It did improve HIV testing or self-reported HIV testing rates, and I think that was a combination of 3 very simple things. One is us encouraging them to get a test. 2 was us telling them, I guess I should say 4 things. 2, saying that legally you're able to get a test without your parents' permission if you choose to. 3 was telling them where in their community they could get a test. So we used we linked into the CDC text messaging system where they could text their zip code and get a response back in terms of where there were clinics in their area. And 4 is we showed them a video. So that's one of the few pieces of media we did, is we texted them a link to a video my center made on what it's like to get an HIV test, where we follow a young person going into a clinic and literally take them through the entire steps of getting an HIV test. And I think it really demystified it for them. They were, I think, if you've never had a test, it can be very scary, and it's much easier to avoid things that are scary than to delve into them. So I think those 4 simple things, like telling them to get a test, telling them that they're legally able to, telling them where, and showing them that video, is what works. And so I don't think we need 6 weeks of messages, 6 to 10 a day, to do that. And so one of the things we're interested in pursuing is perhaps, could we do a more minimal intervention just focused on increasing testing using that formula of those 4 pieces of content. So one of my mentees is looking into potentially pursuing that. But the video and the legal information and the recommendation and the locator are things that we do in our multimedia interventions all the time. So we're pursuing it in that way, yeah. All right, I think I'm wrapped up, yeah.
Terrific. Sorry. Yay.